when it comes to like being top of mind for your clients that are curious about interconnection infrastructure and specifically how they can incorporate offsite into that strategy, I think you got to get really clear about who your ideal clients are. Because unless you have the resources of a giant telecommunications carrier, you more than likely need to pick your battles for where you need to create awareness and educate and build trust. In other words, like, where do your ideal clients tend to be located? The reason that's going to be relevant is if you need to do field marketing, if you're doing a lot of events, for sure, geography matters. If you're running ads, absolutely, geography matters. If you're doing outbound, geography matters. If you're staffing up sales and support teams, for sure, geographic coverage and time zones matter. So let's first figure out in your ideal client profile where these clients are located. Welcome to this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and I'm thrilled to have you joining us this week, where we'll address a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem, from data center operators like hyperscalers, colocation providers, edge, modular, wholesale data centers, as well as data center technology and facilities related companies, data center construction, data center real estate, data center investors, as well as outsourced data center sales and marketing related companies. And regardless of where you sit on a go-to-market team, perhaps you work in sales, marketing, account management, sometimes also known as customer success, product channel partnerships, or perhaps you're the executive sponsor, the leader, the maestro, the orchestra conductor, who is responsible for making sure that you have all the people in the right seats, playing at the right tempo, at the right volume, and working together aligned to create amazing impact and growth throughout data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. If this is the first time you're joining us for the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, welcome. If you're a repeat attendee, welcome back. We're thrilled to have you with us. If you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming educational resources and events just like this, make sure that you're subscribed to our Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter. You can do so directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. So what's on the agenda for this week? First up, we're going to tackle how a data center disaster recovery, DR, and backup solutions provider can improve their go-to-market and their sales meetings. After that, we'll turn our attention to how an interconnection infrastructure firm helps its customers envision the opportunity for offsite. After that, we'll look at how wholesale data center providers can improve their client education. Then we'll take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And in the second half of this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll talk about how a data center design, engineering, and consulting firm can improve its product market penetration, as well as how a modular prefabricated data center provider can find the correct decision maker point of contact. And as we head down the home stretch on this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll also talk about how a digital infrastructure VC venture capital firm can find data center investment opportunities. If you have an idea for a topic, a challenge, a question that you're grappling with yourself, on your team, or as a company that you think we should consider addressing in an upcoming show, make sure to leave that in the comments wherever you're tuning in from. So without any further delay, let's jump right into this week's first question. How does a data center disaster recovery and backup solutions provider improve their go-to-market, their GTM, and their sales meetings? How does a data center disaster recovery and backup solutions provider improve their GTM and their sales meetings? Well, disaster recovery and backup solutions could be two different lines of business. However, for most companies that operate in data center technology or as data center operators that are providing this kind of service, DR, disaster recovery, and backup solutions, often known as BDR, backup and disaster recovery, or business continuity, it's usually one and the same. However, that said, there's definitely some companies that would tend to provide more infrastructure as a service, like technology kinds of solutions that could be sold to clients pretty much anywhere on the planet, as long as they're okay with latency, governance issues, regulatory issues, whatever it is that are unique to your locations. And then there's more of a play around disaster recovery and backup, or like business continuity, that has to do with like hot space, that has to do with space that you can physically go to, you and your team can physically go to in the event that your primary facility is not available. So there's like a technology play, and then there's a real estate part of that. And generally more on the real estate play, you tend to see companies that get a little bit more involved in providing consulting, process improvement workshops to help your team members think through all of these related issues around backup and disaster recovery. What it largely comes down to, though, is you need to think about whether you can offer both of those services, the DR and the backup, to the exact same kind of clients, or whether you envision that this is two different kinds of clients. In other words, how homogeneous is your client list, or are there multiple segments? At the absolute minimum, for a lot of companies in this line of business, probably quite common that you have your direct customers, and then you have your channel partners who bring multiple customers with them. These channel partners might be like managed service providers or network integrators or IT consultancies or something along those lines. So think about your segmentation strategy, what kinds of companies you typically sell to. And the way we'll get to documenting your go-to-markets, your GTM, is look at historically where you've done well. And for this kind of company, it's very common to find the answers to this right on your website homepage. We're looking for your case studies. We're looking for your logos. And we're trying to figure out what those folks have, what those companies have in common. And then once we know what those companies have in common, we should be able to document that in a simple one-page ideal client profile, often known as an ICP. And what are the core building blocks of your ICP, especially for disaster recovery and backup solutions? Is we want to know geographically, where can you do business? The reason this is especially relevant, as I alluded to a few moments ago, is when you're talking about a pure play technology like hosting the data, there's latency, there's governance kinds of issues that come up that are location specific. So with that in mind, once you figure out where your locations are and where your potential clients, where your existing clients and channel partners locations are, where does all of that intersect to work out favorably, where it's good for you and it's good for them? That's the geographic part of the technology play around disaster recovery and backup solutions. If your clients are expecting you to provide space for their team to come in the event of a disaster where you're providing basically temporary office space, then for sure, there's definitely geographic issues that come into play when you're thinking through where you have locations for, I believe they're called hot sites, right? For you to provide this space to companies that are coming in to need this in their time of need versus where they are located. So there's definitely geographic plays for your ICP. There's also company size. In other words, like when you figure out your price points, when you figure out what you're looking for in terms of their minimum level of commitment, what's the floor for like the minimum size their company needs to be to realistically afford your minimums, both on the disaster recovery that's a little more real estate focused and on the backup solutions that's a little more technology focused. What's the minimum company size? And then at the other extreme, what's the maximum company size? At which point their requirements, both on the backup solution side and on the disaster recovery side, may be so complex that your company just is not quite ready for that today. So that will give you a band of company sizes, like a minimum size and a maximum size to include in your ideal client profile. And you'll typically want to standardize that, normalize that around employee headcount, because that's what LinkedIn uses in its database. Most other prospecting databases use employees, sometimes use revenue, in some places around the world known as turnover. But either way, for sure, you need an idea of what's the minimum size they need to be to afford you, and what's the maximum size at which point their requirements may be so overwhelming for your company that you're just not ready for that today. The third part of the ideal client profile is what industries they're located in, what they do. And the reason that that's especially relevant is depending on where your clients are located, there's regulatory issues that come up that are unique to locations and or the intersection of certain industries. Like, for example, in many regions around the world, healthcare and financial services are highly regulated. Government and education, information technology are also tend to be highly regulated in many regions around the world. So if you've made these investments so that your company can provide disaster recovery and backup solutions to those kinds of industries, great. Include that in your ideal client profile. If you know that there's blind spots, if you know that there's weaknesses in your business model where there's certain core groups that want disaster recovery and backup, but you just don't have the credentials to be able to deliver that right now, you need to know about those as well. Because in the same way there's inclusions in your ideal client profile, there needs to be exclusions in your ideal client profile as well. Like, these industries are fantastic, but this industry, these two industries, for example, not so much. We're just not ready for that today. So in terms of your go-to-market, you're improving your go-to-market, improving your GTM for both disaster recovery and backup. The first thing is, from a business model standpoint, is it the exact same client base? If it's the same client base, great. You only need one ideal client profile. You only need one go-to-market. If it's two different kinds of clients, you likely need two different go-to-market playbooks and two different ideal client profiles. Once you've nailed down that ideal client profile, then we want to further segment based on who the key people are that we need to be engaging with, both pre-sales, during onboarding, and post-sales, that we need to create awareness and engagement with, that we need to educate and build trust with. The most important kind of stakeholder, that's your primary buyer persona. The second most important kind of stakeholder that gets involved in disaster recovery and backup solutions with your company, that's called a secondary buyer persona. And depending on how big the company is, there may be a tertiary buyer persona. There may also from time to time be negative buyer personas. A negative buyer persona is someone that shows up and all they want to do is tank your deal. They want nothing to do with what your company does. They're the definition of a detractor, of someone who just basically wants to obstruct your progress on your deal from working with this company. So we need to know about that individual as well, because sometimes they may pretend to be your friend, but they're usually the exact opposite. So once we know your ideal client profile and we know who the key people are, who those buyer personas are, and we prioritize them, then we need to do some research on what these buyer personas care most about. And specifically, we're interested in finding the consensus on their biggest professional goals that they're trying to achieve individually, on their team, as a company, that are at least directly or indirectly related to disaster recovery and backup. And we might think that we know what those goals are, but there's a really good chance that in addition to the internal input that you get from you and talking with your coworkers, you really need to spend some time talking to the actual buyer personas, either face-to-face or video interviews or surveys, or looking at the absolute minimum, looking at their LinkedIn profiles and their search footprint of what comes up, looking at their CRM records. We need to get the consensus on their handful or two of their biggest professional goals that they're working on, and get that consensus in their own words. Not what we think those words are, but what those words actually are. Because that's the difference between everything resonating and everything falling flat. And what do I mean by everything? Your website copywriting, your product marketing, your sales enablement, your events strategy, your social media, your email marketing, your ads, your channel partnerships. The success of all of that depends on getting really clear on what it is that that individual needs to be accomplishing individually, as a team, and as a company, on topics that are directly or indirectly related to backup and disaster recovery. Along the same lines, in addition to their professional goals, which often show up in like OKRs, objectives and key results, and job descriptions. We also need to know what's driving them nuts. What's stressing them out to no end? What are their biggest challenges in their own words? The consensus on looking at least 5, 10, 20 people or so in that segment in their own words on what's completely torturing them, driving them nuts, what's messing with their work-life balance, what's screwing up their ability to unplug and take legitimate vacations, what's messing with their mental health, what's kind of gaslighting them, all of that stuff. We need to know in their own words what exactly those areas are. Because once we understand the biggest goals and the biggest challenges for your primary and your secondary buyer persona, we're going to use that for all of your marketing and sales enablement strategy. We're going to use it for all your copywriting. We're going to use it for your editorial calendar, your events calendar. Everything starts with getting crystal clear on who they are and what they care about. So when we talk about trying to improve your go-to-market, your GTM, and improve your sales meetings, first we need to understand for the backup and disaster recovery, is it one kind of client or two kinds of clients? Regardless of what your answer is, if it's two kinds of clients, you need two go-to-markets and two ideal client profiles and two sets of buyer personas. If you've simplified things enough in your business to where it's one single kind of client, then yeah, it's one ideal client profile, one ICP, and one set of buyer personas. And from there, once we have our go-to-market figured out, everything that we do going forward revolves around educating and building trust with the most important people, with those primary and their secondary buyer personas, and leaning into the idea that in the world we now live in today, the self-driven buyer's journey, most of your best prospects and clients really don't want to spend much time with your sales team until they're almost ready to buy. This is a big change from as recently as 10 years ago, when most prospects and clients used to spend about half of their journey, half of your sales cycle with members of your team. That was the prevailing sentiment about 10 years ago. 56%, CEB, the corporate executive board that's now part of Gartner, found that 56% of a typical sales cycle, of a typical buyer's journey, was over before sales contact and vendor contact, which was not fantastic, but at least you were still in there for the final 44%. Those days are long, long gone in the rearview mirror. 10 years of digital transformation, millions of baby boomers retiring, a lot more millennials and Gen Z in decision-making roles, tens of millions of people working from home at the beginning of the 2020s, millions of people continuing to be working from home. And we now live in a world where that 56% number has jumped all the way to 83%. And we see no signs of that letting up anytime soon. What does that mean? Gartner found that 83% of a typical buyer's journey, researching, comparing options, and evaluating pricing, now happens before sales contact. That means all of the figuring these things out for your buyer personas is happening without your sales team in the room. Best case scenario, they're in there for the final 17%. And this is a really big challenge for a lot of legacy companies, because getting this right requires some big culture changes. In other words, like your account executives, your business development reps, your marketers, your account managers, now in order to earn their way back in there, to have a significant role in that first 83% where they can shape these buyer preferences instead of showing up by their traditional job titles, your marketers, your SDRs, your BDRs, your AEs, your AMs, your CSMs, your product managers, they now need to look a lot more like teachers, consultants, subject matter experts, trusted advisors, and perhaps even thought leaders. That's the way to earn your way in. That's how to stack the decks in your favor so that your prospects and clients will want to spend a significant amount of their professional time, professional development time, learning from you. And when you do this well enough, they'll keep coming back over and over and over again. And you'll spend a lot of those 28 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision with a lot of the right people on these decision committees. But if you keep doing things the way you've always been doing them for the last several years, there's a really big chance that your team, your company is going to be a lot more vulnerable to a competitor or a direct competitor running this playbook and completely marginalizing and knocking you out of the way. Because the companies that are able to have several of these touch points where they're educating and building trust with your prospects, with your clients, these are the ones that are shaping how these prospects and clients navigate this journey, how they evaluate all the different options that are in front of them. And when you do this well, this nearly guarantees that you stay on the short list. When you do this exceptionally well, your prospects and clients are spending so much time with your client-facing team members in this educational context that there's not a lot of time left, not a lot of interest left in them spending much time with anyone else. So this is the scenario under which they start to quote your methodology as their whole way of running this project internally. This is what sets up an environment. So by the time they get to the decision stage, by the time they're at that 83% point, there is no shortlist anymore. Your company is the shortlist. It's a shortlist of one. In other words, you can use these fantastic educational resources and these educational events experiences to basically knock your competitors out of consideration. For most companies, this is a big culture change, but this is the way forward. It's very, very unlikely that we're going to go back to a world where print trade publications are going to have a massive influence, where billboards are going to have a massive influence, where cold calling and cold emailing is going to have a massive influence. Your buyers are in the driver's seat. It's very clear that they prefer the self-driven journey, and the better job you can show up in a way that educates and builds trust, the better off your company is going to be. So that's how I would approach how a data center disaster recovery and backup solutions provider can improve their go-to-market, their GTM, and their sales meetings, because your success during the sales process starts long before that 83% point. And the better job you do with involving your account executives and your SDRs, your sales development reps, and your business development reps, however you're calling them within your company, and your account managers in these educational events, the more it dramatically changes the perception of your value to your prospects and clients in a way that sets you up for success, not only during the sales process, but post-purchase as well. So that's how a data center disaster recovery and backup solutions provider can improve their go-to-market and their sales meetings. If you're getting good value so far out of this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you hit the like button. What do we have up next? What's the next question? How does an interconnection infrastructure firm help customers envision the opportunity for offsite? How does a company that provides interconnection infrastructure help its customers envision the opportunity for offsite infrastructure, offsite interconnection, however you want to brand this, that's relevant to your company, your business model, and your clients? I think it really starts with the idea that your clients that have a need for interconnection infrastructure between multiple locations, between multiple telecommunications providers, where you kind of have to become this meet me room ninja, this interconnection ninja. You're dealing in IXs all day long to the point where you're having dreams about internet exchanges. If you want to really crush it and be the preferred person, the preferred company that your prospects and your clients and your channel partners go to when it comes to anything and everything having to do with interconnection infrastructure, and specifically where offsite fits into all of this, for most companies, this is going to be a pretty big culture change, because there are some companies that are leading the charge in understanding how to reinvent telecommunications to be focused on digital marketplaces, Connect Base being first top of mind. They've been a good supporter of our podcast, so definitely a good shout out to Ben Edmond and his team over there. But when it comes to like being top of mind for your clients that are curious about interconnection infrastructure and specifically how they can incorporate offsite into that strategy, I think you got to get really clear about who your ideal clients are. Because unless you have the resources of a giant telecommunications carrier, you more than likely need to pick your battles for where you need to create awareness and educate and build trust. In other words, like, where do your ideal clients tend to be located? The reason that's going to be relevant is if you need to do field marketing, if you're doing a lot of events, for sure, geography matters. If you're running ads Absolutely, geography matters. If you're doing outbound, geography matters. If you're staffing up sales and support teams, for sure, geographic coverage and time zones matter. So let's first figure out in your ideal client profile where these clients are located. It's very unlikely, unless you have huge resources, that you're going to be able to completely crush it globally in every conceivable language and localization parameter on the planet. Eventually, you could get to that point. But if this is relatively new, if this kind of initiative and improving your go-to-market is relatively new, I would encourage you to pick your battles. So narrow things down geographically, narrow things down by company size. In other words, when it comes to thinking about offsite, how big does their company need to be for realistically them to have a good argument for investing in offsite for internet connection infrastructure? And how large would they be where for sure they'll do offsite, but they may overwhelm your firm's capabilities to work with that company? In other words, could you sell this kind of engagement to a Fortune 50 or Fortune 500 company with your current capabilities? So get self-aware about how big they need to be able to afford the minimums to run offsite interconnection infrastructure, and how large you could support their capabilities with your firm's current capabilities. And then, are there any industries that are an especially good fit and any industries that are an especially bad fit? So basically, we've taken a few minutes and we've documented in a one-page ideal client profile for how we're going to go to market with helping our customers better envision the opportunity for offsite. Once we know the company that we want to create this awareness around to help them better envision what the state would look like with this, then we need to figure out the people, the personas who care most about this topic. And a lot of the job titles, a lot of how you define the specific buyer persona will depend on how big or how small their company is. Generally, the smaller the company is, the more likely it is that you have fewer individuals wearing lots of different hats, doing lots of different jobs, lots of different roles. The larger the company, the more likely it is that you have a much more granular organization chart. So when it comes to interconnection infrastructure, for sure, you'll have people with like IT professionals that have the word infrastructure in their job title. You'll have people that have the word engineering in their job title, probably telecommunications in their job title, network operations, perhaps cybersecurity. There's a variety of different titles that could be especially relevant for this. If there's a strong financial argument for it, your secondary or tertiary buyer persona could be a finance executive, like a CFO. It could be an operations person. But at the end of the day, what you essentially need to do is look at historically where your company has done best, look in your CRM, and look at both pre-sales and post-sales. Who are the people that have played an instrumental role on these decision committees, not just the decision maker, but the decision committee, when it comes to caring about and weighing in on what this company is going to do with their offsite strategy for interconnection infrastructure. Once we have that, it becomes a lot easier to figure out what your primary persona should be and who your secondary persona should be. Then we need to understand what's going on in their worlds. How do their job responsibilities flesh out into their biggest goals and challenges? How do they express those in their own words, especially when it comes to anything and everything having to do with interconnects, when it comes to infrastructure, meet rooms, IXs, anything and everything, basically how to do with telecommunications. Because once we have their own words, it becomes a lot easier to anchor how we're going to explain the benefits of offsite to them in a way that will actually resonate with them. This will drive what you do with your website copywriting. For sure, it'll drive what you do with your sales enablement materials, what you do with your outbound campaigns, what you do with your ads campaigns, and for sure, what you should be thinking about when it comes to planning and promoting and hosting your own educational events that are in person, events that are held virtually online, like live streams and webinars. Ideally, both of those over and over and over again. So you have an argument for spending a lot of time with the right people in the right companies, so they see you as the go-to resource when it comes to anything and everything having to do with planning offsite interconnection infrastructure, probably the broader category of interconnects and telecommunications that are unique to their job role in that geography with a certain size company in a certain kind of industry. And the more hyper specific it is for who they are and where they work, the more likely it is that it will be nearly impossible for them to ignore your fantastic thought leadership content and your fantastic educational events. I think when it comes to envisioning the opportunity for offsite as well, this is where social proof, this is where case studies can also play a really big role in your educational content and your educational events. In other words, if you have a podcast, interview your clients, interview your channel partners who can talk through what it was like to work through an offsite investment, an offsite initiative or program, what it was like before they made the investment, what it was like after the investment, what went into it, what the timeline was looking like, and now that they're on the other side of this, how it's benefited their company financially, productivity, latency, compliance, whatever the benefits are that you want to be able to promote. It's so much easier when, in addition to your own internal subject matter experts, you're bringing in subject matter experts from your clients that are singing your praises and your channel partners that are singing your praises. So yeah, for sure, podcast interviews, webinar panels, offline events, panels that you moderate, multi-sourced ebooks, all of the above. But at the end of the day, if you're trying to get them to envision the opportunity for offsite interconnection infrastructure, it's about really dialing in who they are at a company level, who they are at an individual level, what they care most about professionally, what's frustrating them most professionally, and then show up not only in a way that educates and builds trust, but shows them, introduces them to others who have come before them, navigated that journey with your company, and come out way better off on the other side of implementing offsite infrastructure for interconnection. Someone chimed in the comments, I have data center clients globally. That is awesome. It's terrific now that we have this interconnected world where you can reach clients globally. And it's just really a matter of whether your product and service category is conducive to be able to successfully market, sell, and service those clients globally. So it's fantastic. We have the same thing with DCSMI. We have clients literally all over the globe. And the only thing that makes it a little bit challenging sometimes is making sure that there's time blocks during the week where, like, my evening lines up with their morning. But yeah, for sure, we're way, way, way more globally connected than we ever have been in the past. That's the plus side. The downside is that also introduces more competition from literally all over the globe than you ever have had in the past. So yeah, for sure, as you're defining your ideal client profile, fill in the geography that makes the most sense for your company and be realistic about whether that means that you need sales, marketers, service capabilities, support capabilities that are localized to that particular region, that are located in that region, or whether you can centralize all that. And again, it really depends on the nature of your business model as to how you go about doing that. For a lot of companies, let's say they're headquartered in Europe or headquartered in Asia, and they decide they want to enter into another region of the world the first time through, they a lot of times will work with a channel partner, a series of channel partners to help them make all of that happen. But yeah, I appreciate you sharing that perspective. So next question up is, how does a wholesale data center provider improve client education? How do wholesale data center providers improve client education? So wholesale data center providers, just to be clear and make sure that we're on the same page here, are typically data center operators or just data center providers that are providing much, much, much larger space than like retail colocation. Like retail colocation in the US, you can buy as little as like $200 a month or $800 a month or something, depending on who you're buying this from and how much space and power that you need and the other amenities that you need. The low end, the entry point on colocation kind of is adjacent to the extreme upper end of like web hosting or bare metal infrastructure as a service. The high end of colocation can be much, much, much more complex, where you're looking at selling like entire suites within a colocation facility where it feels like they have almost their own private data center. Wholesale data centers are typically the next level, even way, way beyond that. It's not that you're renting out like a suite where there's potentially dozens of racks, dozens of cabinets in there. you're renting out like an entire building or multiple buildings. In other words, you're building the shell, and then someone else is coming in and finishing it up and customizing that build to suit to fit their specific needs. So for a wholesale data center provider that wants to improve its client education, I think the most important thing is to be very client centric, is to really understand who your perfect client is, who your ideal clients are, where they're located, how big or small they tend to be, what industries they tend to be located in, because there's a very broad range of clients that you could potentially sell wholesale data center space to, from anywhere from colocation providers, telecommunications companies, manufacturing companies, media companies, some cases healthcare companies, in some cases government and education. That brings a whole separate set of additional compliance requirements for on both sides in many cases, depending on where you're located. But at the end of the day, get really, really clear on where these ideal clients are located. In other words, are they looking at your wholesale facility because they already have employees, they already have physical offices in proximity to your facilities, and they like the idea of their IT team being able to hop in the car and get to your facility within 30 minutes? So that's certainly a factor when it comes to defining the geographic part of your ideal client profile. Or are they the other extreme? Do they not care about someone being able to get there within a 30-minute drive? Or maybe they have relationships with like managed service providers or integrators or remote hands or something like that, that fills those particular gaps. But for sure, think through for where you've been most successful in the past, who your ideal clients are, and where they tend to be located. Because for sure, that's going to impact what you want to do with your own marketing strategy or sales strategy, how you help managing their part of the commissioning, their setup process, however deeply you're getting involved, and how you ultimately would support them. Second, how big or how small do these companies tend to be? In other words, like how big are your facilities? Square meters, square footage, what is that going to work out to annually on a 5-year deal, 10-year deal, or whatever it is? And based on some conversations with your CFO, you kind of know what price you need to be able to hit to break even or be profitable on that. And that maps into how big that company needs to be, what kind of capital they need to be able to, what kind of resources they need to have to be able to afford that kind of facility. So that'll help you set the lower bar, the minimum size, at which point you know that someone is qualified versus non-qualified. Depending on the nature of where you're located and how big or small your facility is, maybe the company needs to have at least 50 employees or 200 employees or 500 employees. Again, your results are going to vary quite a bit depending on where you're located, how big or how small your facilities are, what kind of rent you're looking for this facility, and figuring out from a financial model, like who passes diligence, who passes underwriting to be able to make and be able to hold that multi-year commitment. And then there's industries that make more sense than others, both for the sales process, for their requirements, for anything related to requirements that are industry specific. Then within there, like who's the typical person that you're dealing with? And a lot, again, will depend on their size, your size. A lot of times these commitments on wholesale data centers are so large that they're going all the way to the CEO or the board. And if they're not going all the way to that level, they're certainly going to a CFO, they're going to a CTO, they're going to a head of development, like a data center development person, a chief investment officer. They're going to investors who are helping to fund a lot of this. So understand, when you look at your pattern of where you've been successful in the past, who are the stakeholders who have been involved historically, and what do each of them care about? Because they all have different ways of looking at what a wholesale data center means to their business. And it's really important to understand, of those different kinds of stakeholders, how they verbalize their biggest goals and their biggest challenges that are unique to deciding to invest and choose your wholesale data center facility over someone else. And the better job you can do with getting that consensus and be able to prioritize who matters most and ranking them, like primary buyer persona, secondary buyer persona, tertiary buyer persona. In other words, who's showing up on these decision committees, who's involved in these kinds of conversations. This is what's going to help you improve your client education, because client education doesn't really start when they become paying clients, when they sign the agreement. Client education starts months, potentially years before. Because when you look at the timeline for someone making a massive investment on that, it could be that the sales cycle that you know about is weeks. Usually it's more months. Sometimes it's several months bleeding over into more than 12 months. But either way, our goal is to get in as early as possible and as often as possible to be seen as the be-all, end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with what that buyer persona cares about, that's directly related to making a decision on wholesale data center facilities. And the better job you can do with providing this amazingly helpful, insightful professional development experience, like fantastic educational events, educational guides, great breakfast seminars, lunch and learns, workshops, webinars, and providing this over and over and over again in a way that's interesting, so multiple stakeholders from the same company, from the multiple members of the decision committee, are motivated to want to continue showing up and learning from your client-facing team members. That's where you start to shape their belief system. That's where you start to shape what they prioritize, how they evaluate the pros and cons of different approaches, and ultimately how they evaluate the pros and cons of different companies. Because when you think about the 28 touch points typically that comes between complete stranger and a purchase decision, your goal, if you want to have significant surface area where you are able to grow a very, very strong brand that allows you to command premium pricing, that has a smooth, accelerated sales cycle, where your client-facing team members are seen more as teachers and consultants, subject matter experts, trusted advisors, maybe even thought leaders. The goal is to provide so much value that instead of your AEs and your SDRs, your BDRs spending all day begging for meetings, it's the other way around. Your prospects and clients are highly motivated to want to spend time with your client-facing team members because they're learning so much from them. That's what keeps you on the short list. That's what starts to knock other companies off the short list. This is what gets the people from these clients that are attending your educational events to start quoting you and your experts as they define how they're approaching this major initiative, quoting your methodology. And when you do this well, this starts to knock other companies out of the consideration set. When it comes to improving client education, get really dialed into who they are and what they care about, and make a concerted effort. For many companies, this is a big culture change, but it's more important than ever in a self-driven buyer's journey where you're showing up early and often. The client education starts long before they know your company exists, long before they even know what a wholesale data center is. So what are the goals and the challenges that your most important personas have that are a leading indicator that sometime in the next couple of days, next couple of weeks, next couple of months, they're going to come to the conclusion that they need to start investigating different categories, different kinds of wholesale data centers, and ultimately different kinds of companies that could potentially build and lease them wholesale data center space. So that's understanding the journey and figuring out a way for us to show up over and over and over again, early and often. So there's a very, very strong likelihood that by the time they're ready for a sales related conversation, by the time they're really defining this project and dialing it in for where they're going to go, that they've spent so much time with your team, that there's already a very, very strong appreciation of the super smart people that are on your team. The flip side is, if you choose to ignore this, the frustration a lot of times that I'll hear from CEOs is, I don't understand this. They're a perfect prospect, yet they're treating our sales team like crap. They're ignoring us. They're ghosting us. They're no-showing on meetings. They're condescending. They're playing all these silly games. That starts with not getting in early and often, not being seen as the be-all, end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with wholesale data center projects. So if you want to improve client education, this starts with how the marketplace perceives you. Your brand today is about so much more than just your colors and your fonts And your logos, your brand is everything the marketplace says about you when you and your client-facing team members are not in the room. And given that in a self-driven buyer's journey, you're not in the room for the first 83% anymore. By default, you're only in there for the last 17%. If you want to be able to earn your way back in, to have significant coverage, significant involvement in that first 83% of the journey, there is some repositioning that needs to go on. Your team members, your client-facing team members need to show up and look more like Big Four consultants and a lot less focused on someone that just wants to get a deal on the deal board and a real estate transaction closed. So this changes who you hire. This changes how you invest in professional development and cross-training and retraining and upskilling and workforce development. Because at the end of the day, your prospects and clients need to have a pretty good reason to pick your humans, to pick your people over spending time with virtual resources. And the only way that most of your rational, somewhat cynical, somewhat skeptical prospects and clients are going to come to the conclusion that they want to spend significant amounts of time with your client-facing team is if your client-facing team members can add a ton of value to this kind of initiative. Big culture change for a lot of companies, but this is the path forward. This is the new competitive battleground. This is what it takes to win and succeed as a wholesale data center provider. So that's how I would approach how a wholesale data center provider can improve client education. If you're getting value so far out of this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you hit the like button. And if you have an idea for a topic, a question, a challenge that we should address in an upcoming episode of Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A, make sure to leave that in the comments and we'll get that in the queue for an upcoming show. The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com. Hey there, it's Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and we're thrilled to have you joining us for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. So what's up next? How does a data center design, engineering, and consulting firm improve product market penetration? How does a data center design, engineering, and consulting firm improve its product market penetration? That is a fantastic question. So generally, companies that provide design, engineering, consulting firm in a perfect world are providing all three of these services to the exact same clients. And if you do, your go-to-market, your strategy for improving product market penetration is a lot simpler than if you're running essentially three different lines of business, three businesses under the same umbrella. So to keep things simpler here, we're going to go with the idea that your clients that you're choosing to pursue are going to be the kinds that don't cherry pick you and instead want your expertise that wraps all this together. So you're able to provide design services, engineering services, and consulting services to the same base of clients. So if we want to improve our market penetration, there's a couple things to think about. For starters, I think a lot of companies, specifically in design, engineering, and consulting, which when we think about the data center ecosystem, this is both a facilities and a construction kind of play. So it hits in a couple of different parts of the data center ecosystem. It really doesn't have that much to do with technology. It certainly doesn't have to do with outsourced sales and marketing, but it for sure is at least adjacent to construction and real estate. It for sure is adjacent to a couple different segments within data center facilities related companies, certainly way more than the technology part of the data centers. So if we want to improve our product market penetration, we need to recognize that your buyers today research and make these decisions quite differently than they did as recently as 5, 10 years ago. If I was answering this question 10 years ago, we could count on the fact that most of your best prospects and clients would do some research on their own, and then they'd get to about the halfway point and they would be ready to spend a significant amount of time with one or more members of your sales team. 10 years ago, that number hovered around 56%. That was research done by CEB, the Corporate Executive Board, that's now part of Gartner. What did that mean? Well, 56% of their research, their buyer's journey, your sales cycle, was over before they were willing to meet with someone from your sales team. That wasn't too bad. That means at that time, that meant you had about 44% of that initiative left to influence how they looked at the different choices that were in front of them for design and engineering and consulting. However, that's now nostalgia. That's very much in the rearview mirror. 10 years of digital transformation, millions of baby boomers retiring, Gen Z, millennials in a lot more decision-making roles, tens of millions of people now being comfortable working from home at least part of the time. And that 56% number has jumped all the way to 83%. Gartner has found that 83% of a typical buyer's journey, researching, comparing options, and evaluating pricing, now happens in a self-service, self-driven way. That means that even if you do everything really, really well, you're only going to be in there for the last 17% of their research and decision-making process. And this is an enormous problem because it's during that 83% that they're figuring things out, that they're learning all about the adjacent topics, niches, subject areas, challenges, and goals that have anything and everything having to do with data center design, engineering, and consulting. So the question is, do you want your prospects and clients to be learning from your team, or do you want them to be learning from your competitors? And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're learning from your direct competitors. These could be indirect competitors that you are completely underestimating. What's the difference between direct and indirect competitors, especially when it comes to data center design, engineering, and consulting? An indirect competitor that you may be underestimating and overlooking is a company that's a lot bigger or a lot smaller than yours. And because of that, you tend to disregard them, especially if they're a lot smaller. You may also be disregarding them because you're headquartered in a certain region and they're not. In other words, you think you're winning 100% of the time because you have the geographic advantage. But there's some other things that you know about their future growth aspirations that will neutralize that pretty quickly. So do you want them to be learning from your team? Or do you want them to be learning from your competitors, your direct or indirect competitors, or even non-business model competitors? What's a non-business model competitor? This could be a media company. This could be a conference, an events company, a channel partner program, an analyst. It's someone that's creating fantastic educational content and great educational events on anything and everything having to do with data center design, data center engineering, data center consulting, where they're able to attract a significant amount of attention, earn a significant amount of mind share from your ideal prospects and clients. And because of that, that entity, that non-business model competitor, has a massive impact on how your prospects and clients ultimately decide what's important versus what's not important, what they decide to prioritize and what they decide to deprioritize. So the question is, now that we know how dominant this self-driven buyer's journey is, and now that we know that your ideal clients are likely learning a ton about how they're going to navigate this project long before they get to the initial conversation with you, to the point where if you only first meet someone when they're 83% of the way through, most of the time it's too late. And the only thing that's going to win is you're immediately treading water. The only thing that's going to win is cheaper. And, that's the race to the bottom. So we don't want to be forced and backed into the corner most of the time into price competition. So the way that we are able to earn a premium, the way we're able to have a stronger brand, the way we're able to have your ideal prospects and clients recognize that you have some of the smartest people on the planet when it comes to data center design, data center engineering, and data center consulting is we need to take your account executives, your business development reps, your sales development reps, your account managers, your project managers, and instead of them showing up using the same job titles that they have for the last 5 or 10 years, they now need to show up and be consultants and teachers and subject matter experts and put across the vibe of trusted advisor and thought leader. This is the path forward. This changes the nature of how you hire. This changes the nature of how you invest in professional development. Even for your relatively junior team members that may not have several years of industry experience in design, engineering, and consulting, there's a role for them as well once they're through onboarding and they've been in the space maybe 6 months or so, is they can still be like a tour guide or a concierge that can help moderate some of these panels, organize some of these resources, point your best prospects and clients in the direction of other resources on your team, some of the more seasoned resources on your team. But make no mistake, the battle for winning over the hearts and the minds and conquering the emotional part of product market penetration starts very, very early on. So once we know that there's going to be 28 touch points that are going to significantly influence how your prospects and clients ultimately make these decisions, our goal is to show up and have a presence in as many of those 28 touch points as possible. And the way to get in early and the way to get in often is to think about what you need to do as a company to change the culture of your company so that it is a major priority for the industry, for data, anyone and everyone, anyone within data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities that fits your ideal client profile needs to know without a doubt that you have some of the top experts on the planet when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center design, engineering, and consulting for their particular kind of job in that particular region for roughly that company size and that kind of industry. And the more hyper-specific your resources are, the more it's nearly impossible to ignore you. Because if you think about someone scrolling through a feed, and it doesn't matter whether this feed is LinkedIn, it doesn't matter whether this feed is on a search results page or YouTube, whatever, like imagine someone is multitasking. They're thinking about 3, 4, 5 things at a time. We need to be so hyper relevant for who they are and what they care about that we're literally like grabbing them and pulling them into the screen by the virtual shirt collar. It's got to be that relevant, that much value, focused on what they care most about. Not what you want them to care about, but meeting them where they are with what you know they actually care about. How do we know what they actually care about? Because we've asked them. We've done the actual customer insight research. We've built out and documented and prioritized the buyer personas. So we know in their exact words what their biggest goals are when it comes to data center design, engineering, and consulting. What's frustrating the heck out of them, what's stressing the most, what their biggest challenges are when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center design, engineering, consulting. And we roll all of that together and we take some of the smartest internal subject matter experts that we have and perhaps some external ones as well. And we decide that going forward, we're going to have the best educational resources, the best educational events on the planet in the industry when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center design, engineering, and consulting, specifically for very specific kinds of data center, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure professionals that line up really, really well with the kinds of clients that we've historically done well with in the past. So when it comes to improving product market penetration, the way to cut through is being found early and being found often with the right people in the right places at the right time, which means as many of those 28 touch points as possible. They're coming to many, many of your educational events, many of your webinars, enjoying tons of your podcasts and videos and email newsletters and spreading those to all of their colleagues across their team and across other teams in their company in a way that you're completely saturating the surface area about anything and everything having to do with design, engineering, consulting. That's the way that you go about improving product market penetration. It's about being a lot more client focused on what they care about and a lot less focused on what you care about, because early on, they don't really care much about how wonderful you are. They just don't. They're only going to be interested in that when they get to that 83% point, when they're just about at the purchase point. Early on, they just know that there's a big goal that they're trying to achieve. There's some big struggles that are driving them nuts. And the better job you can do with showing them a better path forward, with arriving and coming across more like the teacher, the consultant, the trusted advisor, and the subject matter expert, the more likely it is that you're going to get a warm reception, and the more likely it is that they're going to be very open to your recommendations that they bring along their other team members with them, who in many cases is getting you introduced to the rest of the decision committee. Hey, Bob, hey, Sue, I see that you registered for our Lunch and Learn event coming up next Wednesday on data center design and engineering best practices for financial services infrastructure professionals, whatever the topic of the agenda is. But we know it takes a village. Typically, there's people involved from this job function and that job function and construction and commissioning and site selection and finance and legal and compliance, whatever it is, the 4, 5, 6 different functions that you know are relevant to your company's specific business model. So with that in mind, who else would also benefit from attending? Simply hit the forward button, let them know a thought or two on why you're attending. And we'd love to help encourage an environment where teams that learn together grow together. You'd be shocked, whether it's a webinar, a downloadable guide, a lunch and learn event, a breakfast event, whatever it is, that simple email marketing automation that you've been able to do for like 20 years now, how much it works. And you know it works because you're looking down at your event registration, email confirmations, you're looking in your CRM system, wherever you're keeping track of all this, you're like, cool, 5 people, 7 people, 3 people from the same company, all registered in the last hour. They're talking about us. Awesome. That's how you drive alignment across multiple stakeholders in the same committee, which is from the same company on that decision committee. That's an incredibly important part of improving your product market penetration, but it comes from the standpoint of delivering massive, overwhelming, unique value from a professional standpoint that helps them do their jobs better, that helps their team achieve their objectives and key results better, that helps their company achieve their goals better, and that helps solve some of the biggest challenges and frustrations that they know that they currently have around data center design, engineering, and consulting. So that's how a data center design, engineering, and consulting firm can improve their product market penetration. If you're getting good value from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you hit the like button to help spread the word and share the love. Next question up is, what do we got? This one's about modular data centers. Oh, this is a fantastic question. It's funny. I've been following modular data centers now for, I guess, the better part of a decade. And it doesn't surprise me that they're having a moment now, just like a lot of the data center industry, because the flexibility, the speed, all of the building blocks are there for a lot of success with modular prefab data centers that can be manufactured in a factory and delivered to locations and cut months or a year or two of lead time down to weeks or even days. So what do we have? So the question is, how does a modular prefabricated data center provider find the correct decision maker point of contact? How does a modular prefabricated data center provider find the correct decision maker point of contact? Yeah, that is a great question. And one of the first places to start is to recognize that we now live in a world where people have become so much more cynical and so much more skeptical, so much more risk averse, that it's very rare that there's just a single decision maker anymore for any kind of major considered purchase for a modular prefabricated data center. These are major purchase decisions. There's no such thing as a modular prefabricated data center that's just going to go on someone's corporate card, right? These are massive decisions that are smaller than building a facility that does the same thing that's permanently there, but it's still way bigger than like renting colocation space, right? Other things being equal. So the first thing to recognize is there's rarely a single decision maker anymore. It's usually a decision committee, because even if you can manage to get the perfect introduction, the magic meeting with the decision maker, it's extremely likely that the pushback that you're going to get from the CFO, the CEO, the board member, the chief development officer, the chief growth, whoever is the person that you perceive is ultimately going to be the sign off is going to say, this sounds good, but you didn't meet with the rest of our team yet, right? So yeah, give John a call, give Jessica a call, whoever it is, Karen a call, whoever is going to be running this, set up time to meet with them and their team and make sure that they're on the same page. If they're good with this, I'm good with this. So in nearly all cases, you're going to get bounced back to a decision committee anyway. So the first thing to recognize is there is no magic decision maker anymore. There are multiple decision makers. And one of the biggest jobs, one of the most complex jobs for an account executive is figuring out how to drive alignment across multiple stakeholders from the same team and multiple teams within the same company. And in many cases, even teams and external stakeholders that are going to weigh in on this kind of initiative as an extension of that particular company. So yeah, that's one of, if you thought being an account executive for a modular data center provider was challenging 5 or 10 years ago, it continues to get even more challenging, because one of the most important skill sets that a sales professional in this space brings to the table is being the consummate project manager, the consummate aligner in chief, to help support the internal champion, to help the internal champion bring the rest of their team members and multiple teams throughout the company on board with all of this. So to find the correct decision maker point of contact, yeah, for sure, use Sales Navigator. There's literally a link or button that you click on that tells you the list of how LinkedIn Sales Navigator perceives the decision maker to be. The most impactful way to not only understand who's on that decision committee, but start to win them over is to get very client focused. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's dial in our go-to-market, our GTM first. Let's take a minute or two and just make sure that we have clarity on this. We need to know, for these modular data center buyers, where are they located? We know this is an issue because modular data centers have to be transported from your factory or factories to their location. So we know for sure geography is a factor in your ideal client profile. Second, how big or how small do these companies tend to be? It's probably more a minimum size than worrying about a maximum size, but you know your price points, you know your minimums. Realistically, how big does that company need to be to likely have the amount of capital and the resources to invest in one of your modular data centers? Do they need to have at least 10 million in revenue, 50 million in revenue, 100 million in revenue? Does that map to a 50-person company, a 200-person company, a 500-person company? How big does that company need to be in terms of their resources to afford your minimum commitment, your minimum purchase, your minimum invest in one of your modular data centers? There's a scenario with modular data centers where a Fortune 100, Fortune 500 company could have such demanding requirements that maybe your company doesn't have the resources to deliver on this quite yet. And they may prefer a bigger, safer alternative that can meet all of their regulatory issues, legal issues, financial issues, whatever it is. So it's possible the employee headcount, the size, the company size needs an upper guardrail in your ideal client profile as well. Again, only you can answer that depending on the nature of who you think is going to be on your target account list and your company's own internal resources. And then there are certain industries that are better fit than others, where you want to specifically go after those industries, or you want to specifically stay away from certain industries. From that ideal client profile, you should be able to build out a target account list of anywhere from a couple dozen, usually a couple hundred, could be as many as a few thousand potential accounts, potential companies that line up with that ideal client profile. And then once we have the ideal client profile and the target account list built, then we need to segment within that ideal client profile and understand who the people are, the individual stakeholders that care most about, whose careers are dependent on the success of this modular data center initiative. And the most impactful person on the decision committee, we're going to call your primary buyer persona. And we need to study the heck out of their goals and challenges when it comes to anything and everything having to do with modular prefabricated data centers. And then we need to do the same thing with the second most important kind of stakeholder for a modular data center provider. Maybe the primary is a CEO or a chief investment officer, chief development officer, or something like that. And maybe the secondary is your finance person. Maybe the third person is a legal or a compliance person or something like that, or an ESG person. Again, this is going to vary depending on the nature of how you've defined your business model, how you've defined your target market, and how big or small where they're located and what their industries are. But at the end of the day, we need to designate and prioritize who matters most. Because who matters most is what's going to allow us to get strong consensus when we do our customer insight research, to understand what they see the biggest goals are and what they see the biggest frustrations are when it comes to investing in a modular data center. Because we're going to use that information to make sure that our website copywriting, our messaging is spot on for not only who they are, but what they care about. And most of all, how they articulate those biggest goals and articulate how their exact words on how they vocalize those biggest frustrations. And we're going to do the same thing for our secondary buyer persona. Each of those certainly important enough that each should have a separate slot, a separate box on your homepage, a separate slot on your website navigation, their own website page, their own explainer video, their own lead generation offer, perhaps their own webinars, their own planning guides. We really need to nail relevancy. And then we're going to use basic outbound. We're going to use basic ads to make sure that we hit many different stakeholders within these companies with our educational resources, with our downloadable planning guides, with our special reports, with our tools, and most of all, with our educational events invitations to attend our offline educational events, to attend our workshops, our symposiums, our breakfast seminars, our lunch and learns, attend our webinars over and over and over again with a strong motivation, a strong incentive to make it so hyper relevant that they're highly motivated to want to spread that information, to their coworkers, to their boss, to their colleagues, to people on other teams. When you say, gee, when it comes to investing in a modular data center, it takes a village. It's truly a team initiative. There's typically people that are involved from the executive, the board, finance, technology, legal, compliance, whatever, like real estate, 4, 5, 6 different stakeholders mention those. So with that in mind, who else would benefit from reading this, from watching this, from attending this? Just hit the forward button, let them know why it's important to you, because we found that teams that learn together, grow together, and alignment is an incredibly important part of your success with this kind of initiative. You'd be shocked how well that simple 2-3 line email marketing message that you send to people that have already downloaded, registered, subscribed, whatever, by suggesting that, how often that works. Because at that point, they're not recommending that their boss, their colleagues, other team members invest in buying your modular data center. All they're saying is, yeah, I found this great guide. I found this great video. I found this great webinar. I found this great event. I think this is super relevant for what we're doing. I think you'll get a lot of value from attending as well. That's what helps you understand who's truly on the decision committee. Sure, Sales Navigator, LinkedIn Sales Navigator can help you get a head start on all of that. But ultimately, when you see the multiple people that are showing up and how they're engaging and how they're participating, all of these things are incredibly impactful to understanding who's on that decision committee and what they care about. How do you know what they care about? Here's another great takeaway, aside from asking people who else should attend, is whenever someone subscribes, downloads, registers, do you have like a free form field on your contact form where you ask them what's your biggest question about, what's your biggest struggle about, what's your biggest modular data center goal, frustration, challenge, whatever, however you want to vocalize it, and get them to write that in their own words? Because when you do, that input from them is worth its weight in go-to-market gold. It is incredibly valuable to understanding how they vocalize their biggest frustration, their biggest challenge, what they care most about. It's also incredibly impactful for you to take, let's say you have 5 people from the same company that have given you 5 right-in answers. It helps to see, are they all basically saying the same thing, or are they saying different things? It's like X-ray vision to understanding what's going on in their brains when it comes to how they look at this topic, how they look at this kinds of initiatives. So not only does it help you have better sales conversations and better customize your events experiences and content for this particular person, it helps you to aggregate this at a company level. And of course, you can aggregate this across all of the responses, the registrants that you have on a persona basis to refine and improve your content and your events topics over time. So when it comes to how a modular prefabricated data center can find the correct decision maker point of contact, once you understand how much of a role the self-guided buyer's journey plays, and the most important stakeholders on this doing a ton of research on their own before they're ready to talk with someone from your sales team. Way, way, way more of this than they would have done 5 or 10 years ago. It becomes incredibly important for your company to show up in a way that you're seen as the be-all, end-all experts, the educators, the consultants, the subject matter experts, the trusted advisors, the thought leaders on anything and everything having to do with a successful modular data center project. From the point of view of this kind of stakeholder in this particular geographic region for roughly this company size, and perhaps either for a certain industry or certain vertical that's hyper relevant. And the more value that you're able to provide to these individuals, the more motivated they are to want to spend many, many, many of those 28 touch points with members of your client facing team. And the more the time they spend with you, the more the education and the trust building works. The more they start to understand your way, your methodology for successfully planning this kind of project, for successfully planning this kind of modular data center investment. So this not only tells you how to get to the decision committee, this helps you understand who cares about what. And when you have that kind of insight, not only does this basically guarantee that you stay on the short list, it gives you such an advantage, and they're spending so much time with you that they really don't have a lot of time and interest in spending much of it with your competitors anymore. So the shortlist starts to collapse very quickly to the point where when you do this exceptionally well, the shortlist may collapse down to 1, meaning that like you're the last company standing when they finally get to that decision point, when they finally get to that 83% point. And when that happens, like the price sensitivity is gone, right? You know, they see you as the be all end all experts. Why would they talk to anyone else unless they're mandated to find a lower price? But you've already at that point explained your value. You've already explained what you're doing that's unique. You've already helped them understand why they need to prioritize certain aspects of modular data centers that you're uniquely positioned to be able to deliver that nobody else on the planet can actually deliver. And the trust is, the affinity is just off the charts. They've fallen in love with your content. They've fallen in love with your events experiences. They've fallen in love with your team. The level of trust on your team members is like incalculable, off the charts. The goodwill is incredibly high. And this factors in very, very, very well for a much smoother sales process, better onboarding, better account management, better account expansion, land and expand, better cross-selling, better referrals, better reviews, better participation in case studies. It all starts with getting really, really dialed into what they care most about when it comes to anything and everything having to do with modular data centers. So that's how a modular prefabricated data center provider can find the correct decision maker points of contact, and most importantly, even more importantly, be successful with those correct decision maker points of contact. So that brings us to the final question that we're going to look at for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you have a question, a topic, a challenge that you're up against that you'd like us to consider adding to the queue for an upcoming show, make sure to leave that in the comments wherever you're watching today. So the final question for this week: how does a digital infrastructure VC venture capital firm find data center investment opportunities? How does a data center venture capital VC firm find data center investment opportunities? And kind of the first cousin of the venture capital firm, the private equity firm, would likely take a similar approach with all of this. So there's a couple of ways to approach this that I see working especially well within data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. Way number one is to recognize that your brand in today's global marketplace is no longer limited to what you say about yourself. It's no longer, your brand is no longer limited to just the fonts and your hexadecimal colors and your brand guide and your logos. Your professional brand, both individually and as a team and as a company, is now everything that the marketplace says about you when you and your client-facing team members, when your company is not in the room. And given that in a self-driven buyer's journey, you're not in the room anymore for the first 83% of the buyer's journey, we need to figure out a way to get you back in the room. Because if 83% of founders, entrepreneurs decision on which VC firm, which venture capital firm to go with is happening without you being in the conversation. An enormous amount of the affinity, the loyalty of who they're going to go with is decided before you ever meet that founding team, before you ever meet the founder, before you meet the entrepreneur. And that just does not put you in a good position. The companies that are doing well with countering this are building strong professional brands where their executive team members are constantly speaking at events. They're constantly on podcasts. They're constantly hosting their own webinars. They're constantly publishing great thought leadership materials, downloadable materials. They have great websites, great LinkedIn presence. In other words, they've leaned into the fact that in order for them to earn their way back in, to have significant surface area, to have a significant role in those really impactful, formative stages, the formative years, the formative months, the formative weeks, whatever it is, for how the founder decides who's going to be on the short list of VCs that they'll send a cover letter to, that they'll want to go in and go through their pitch deck with. That's all happening when your founders, when these entrepreneurs that are potentially looking for a VC are learning. And in order for you to show up in a way that you're able to be seen less like a VC who's just focused on the cap table and just focused on getting a deal closed, and more as someone who can dramatically impact a host of related and interrelated topics having to do with growing their company that's going to need funding in the near future, the more important it is for you to show up and be seen more like a teacher, a consultant, a subject matter expert, a trusted advisor, maybe even a thought leader when it comes to anything and everything having to do with this particular data center related business and this founding team's biggest goals that they're trying to achieve and the biggest frustrations that they currently have. So in much the same way with any other kind of go-to-market, I would encourage you to sit down and define your ideal founder profile. We have an ideal client profile that's well known in ICP that people talk about all the time. We want an ideal founder profile. Who is the ideal startup that we want to look for at a company level? So maybe we want to call it an ideal startup level, ideal startup profile, ideal scale-up profile. Or we need to know geographically where they're located. Realistically, can we invest and adequately support with board seats people all over the planet, or are we looking primarily for specific geographic regions? Second, we need to know at what stage they are. What milestones have they hit? Are they seed? Are they Series A? Are they Series B? What are they looking for in terms of the amount of funding and their investment stage, with how complex the governance structure is within that certain company? And third, this is a really, really big one, is within the data center ecosystem, what are the kinds of companies where we can add the most value? Over at DCSMI, we catalog 52 different kinds of companies in and around the data center ecosystem, on top of 5 different kinds of data center operators across. So we think about like the segmentation. There's operators, there's data center technology companies, there's data center facilities related companies, data center construction, data center real estate, data center investors, your category, right? Data center VCs and data center private equity. And then there's outsourced sales and marketing. The kinds of data center related businesses that are going to be most likely to seek venture funding are more than likely going to be data center operators, data center technology companies, or data center facility related companies. That's still a few dozen different kinds of business models. So at the end of the day, given your personal expertise and your partners internally, externally, your expertise that you can loop in and bring to the table to help evaluate whether your company should invest in this deal or not, and how you could support this team ultimately with board seats, that's an individual decision based on your career experience. In other words, like if multiple members of your VC firm have roots in the hyperscaler world, well, then great. If you can invest in companies that are trying to do something transformative, trying to do something disruptive for hyperscalers or as a hyperscaler, is great. You have a strong competitive edge and advantage. If the company that approaches you is trying to do something with liquid natural gas and you have zero expertise when it comes to data center energy, then maybe that's something that you pass on. So I would encourage you to document kind of the first cousin of the ideal client profile. This would be like the ideal startup profile, the ideal scale-up profile, whatever this is that defines where they're located, at what stage they're at, and what industry, what segment within the data center ecosystem that they're located in. And then we need to understand who this persona is and what they care most about. And your primary buyer persona, in most cases, you're probably going to be limited to just a primary buyer persona. It's possible that there's a secondary stakeholder, there's a secondary kind of founder member on the founding team that has a significant say over this. Maybe there's a CEO and a technical co-founder like a CTO, in which case you'd split this up if they have different concerns. In many cases, when it comes to funding, their concerns are probably aligned. And if their concerns aren't aligned, they may cause a lot of headaches if you decide to fund them, invest on them, and take a board seat. So we need to know for the founder or founders what their biggest goals are that they're trying to figure out when it comes to getting funding, and what they're frustrated most about when it comes to getting funding and scaling and growing their business. And we also need to know what are the handful of adjacent goals, adjacent challenges, struggles that they're currently going through that lead someone to be needing a funding event to happen sometime in the coming weeks or coming months. Because our goal, just like any kind of go-to-market, is we want to intercept these founders as early as possible and as often as possible. Because we don't want them to just see us as just another VC. We want them to see us as a VC who brings incredibly valuable insights and impact and expertise that they just can't get elsewhere. So they're learning a ton from you. If you think about like 28 touch points that someone might go through in a considered purchase, your founders may go through similar kinds of things. They may go through considerably more if they get a lot of rejections and no's at the pitch phase. But the idea is, as they're learning about what it's going to take to grow and scale their company, the more often you can show up with helpful, unique expertise, the more likely it is that they're going to heavily favor going to your company as being the lead investor or secondary investor on their cap table for this particular funding round. And a lot of these same topics and challenges and questions that you're addressing in your blogs, in your email newsletters, in your printed research, and your LinkedIn content, your YouTube content, your webinars, your educational events, your speaking appearances, all of these goals and challenges, some of them may be unique to pre-funding, some of them may be unique to post-funding, but it's very, very common for VCs to bring their portfolio companies together after funding to provide group learning on an ongoing basis on a professional development context, where you bring in a subject matter expert and you bring in all of the salespeople, all the marketing people, all the product people, all the finance people, segmented similar to how you might do a breakout session at a conference, except they're learning together, they're cross-pollinating, they're sharing kind of as an extended part of that VC's company with their portfolio companies, having relationships among each other where they're sharing these best practices. So a lot of that research that you're doing to figure out what your content and your event should look like, to add a lot of value to the founders, to the entrepreneurs pre-funding, when they're deciding which VCs to talk to in the first place, is the same kind of topical approach that you'd want to take post-funding as well, to help support their growth in a professional development context. So that's the content, that's the thought leadership approach. There's also the outbound approach, because once you have defined that ideal startup profile, that ideal client profile, you can go and build out a list of startups that fit that profile and use outbound outreach to try to figure out a way to get in front of them. You could try to get to an initial meeting, a virtual coffee or an in-person coffee. In many cases, you may want to lead with educational resources. Hey, love to see what you're working on at XYZ company. It sounds like you're doing some amazing work in the technology, the software, whatever you're doing for hyperscalers or energy or whatever the facet is. We've talked to a lot of folks like yourself, and we've developed this resource guide of the 10 best practices that every seed stage, every Series A founder needs to be thinking about when it comes to this. I think you'll get a lot of value from reading this. If after you've downloaded, if you want to set up a time to talk with a member of our team, you'll find a calendar link on the confirmation page and the email as well. Look forward to helping to support your journey. So that would be like a typical outbound campaign, complementing what you're doing with content and events. But at the end of the day, your outbound could have the feel of, it was interesting. I interviewed on the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast the chief innovation officer for Vertiv a little while back. And we talked through the idea of how Vertiv has used this idea of scouts over the years. These are people that work out in the field, generally that are connected in some way, shape, or form to research institutions and academia, that are in a position to scout and see these upcoming innovations around power, cooling, data center, energy-related technologies that are coming to play, and bringing these to the attention of the company as potentially ones where the company would want to take some kind of role in supporting, funding, partnering, something like that along those lines. So there for sure could be a scenario too where a digital infrastructure VC, where their partners and their extensions of their companies and their extensions of their extensions, where they have a infrastructure set up where there's dozens of different companies that go to all these different parts of the ecosystem, all these different conferences, and are on the lookout and scouting for the next kind of company that they should be investing in. And part of their job is uncovering the hidden talent, the uncovered gem that nobody is talking to quite yet. So there's a couple of different ways to approach all of this. For sure, things like speaking at conferences, speaking on webinars, speaking on other people's podcasts, having a great LinkedIn presence, a great YouTube channel, all of that helps tremendously, as long as it's very client focused, which in this particular case would be founder focused, entrepreneur focused, on helping to support their biggest goals and challenges. Beyond that, there's certainly an outbound, like scouts driven kind of approach that we were talking about, where you identify specific companies and offer them a virtual coffee, a consultation, assessment, a downloadable resource, an events invitation, something like that, where they can learn about some topics that are top of mind for a founder, for an entrepreneur at that particular stage. But it's really all of the above. It's trying to build a strong professional brand, a strong company brand, so data center founders, data center entrepreneurs at these very early stage companies see over and over and over again that you are by far and away the best VC, the best venture capital firm to go to when they're looking for partnering. Because over time, it doesn't take long for them to figure out that not all funding is created equal. Some money is better than other money, and there's certain kind of board members that can be incredibly impactful. There's certain kind of investors or board members that will have no impact. And there's certain kind of board members, unfortunately, that could have a negative impact. So for sure, the better job you can do with getting out in front with this, with educating and building trust, just like you would with prospects, just like you would with clients, just like you would do with potential employees, just like you would do with channel partners. It's the same basic idea. So that's how I would approach how a digital infrastructure VC, venture capital firm, can find data center investment opportunities. So that's the final question that I'll be addressing in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, make sure that you hit the like button. If you have a topic, a question, a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming episode, be sure to leave that in the comments. If you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming educational events and educational resources just like this, make sure that you're subscribed to our Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter, which comes to your email inbox each Sunday. You can subscribe directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. And if we're not currently connected on LinkedIn, just mention that you watched this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. We'd love to know what you found most helpful, and feel free to send me a connect request with that little note, and would love to be connected with you on LinkedIn as well. I'm Joshua Feinberg, Feinberg, from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. And we're so glad that you were able to join us for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. And we look forward to seeing you back again next week. Take care now.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.